Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy at the City University of New York at Rivers College. I am Professor O. Felix Obi, and today is Tuesday, April 29th, 2025. We will now commence the formal lecture part of today's office hour and lecture. So, as you know, as you must now know, today is our 13th module, and today our lecture will be on international debt crisis. Of course, I am sure you also remember that last week's lecture was on international economic development. As we learned earlier on international monetary relations, when a country is unable to pay for all its imports from its exports, it has to borrow money to make up the difference. And I'm guessing that everybody in the class by now knows that when a country is unable to pay for its imports from the revenue from its exports, that country would be said to be experiencing a balance of trade deterioration. So I'm hoping that we all know that by now. So these borrowings may accumulate. That is, the borrowing a country takes to purchase imports. They may accumulate, thereby making it difficult for a country to participate in international trade, which in turn creates social, economic, and political problems within that country. This is why, in large part, where IMF extends a credit facility often also experience social, economic, and political problems within that country. These countries often predates the extension of facilities from the IMF. These challenges often are a consequence of the economic mismanagement that creates the necessary creates the necessity to borrow from the IMF. So accordingly, these are our 4 learning objectives for today's class. The first learning objective is to explain the cause of international debt crisis. The textbook cause of international debt crisis includes 1, irresponsible lending on the part of creditors. Realizing that this irresponsible lending does not come from the IMF. IMF is otherwise known as the lender of last resort. IMF facilities often come after countries have borrowed for projects that simply did not pan out, to put it very charitably. So the textbook cause of international debt crisis includes 1, irresponsible lending on the part of creditors. 2, mismanagement on the part of debtors. And 3, worldwide recession. And we saw a little bit of this during COVID, where there was a worldwide recession, and those payment crises that many countries experienced were due to exogenous factors rather than endogenous factors. It happened again, although with less severity, especially for African countries who were unable to afford grains when Russia initially invaded Ukraine. So economic growth, population expansion, and increased government spending drive the need for borrowing. During economic downturns, governments intensified borrowing to stimulate economic activity and provide financial support, which can, at least in the short term, exacerbate debt crisis. But because of 2008 financial crisis, we now also know that a laissez-faire attitude or a doctrine opposing government interference in economic affairs beyond the minimum necessary for the maintenance of peace and property rights can lead to weak regulation that can result in moral hazard for businesses. I am hoping that we all now know what moral hazard is, and I do not have to again define it. And the integration of especially financial markets in at least this situation can become the vehicle for contagion of the international debt crisis. The second learning objective for the week is describe debt restructuring. Debt restructuring is a process that involves negotiating with creditors to reduce interest rates, extend repayment term, or cut loan balance. Restructuring can help make debt situation more manageable through smaller payments, lower interest rates, or reducing the overall debt burden. Of course, interest rate is a big part of the total figure that one has to, or a country has to, in this case, has to repay in servicing that debt. So if you reduce the interest rate, you also reduce the interest part of the servicing amount, which obviously reduces the debt burden. There are three major ways to restructure a debt. One, through bondholders. Two, haircut. Three, negotiating payment terms. And three, debt for equity swap. A classic example that is often cited and debated of the latter is the Sri Lanka's 99-year lease at Hambantota port to China due to Sri Lanka's inability to repay the debt. So very briefly, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka was financed by the Chinese. And the Sri Lankan government had these big ideas on how that new port facility would be a hub for international shipping lanes and therefore international commerce. It did not quite pan out that way. The economic activity was not did not pan out as hoped. And of course, the Sri Lankan government was still on the hook to service the debt to the Chinese for building the port. And when they became unable to service that debt, they were forced or they had to resort to signing a 99-year lease to the Chinese to manage that port for 99 years. Of note, many, if not all members of the Paris Club, a group of major creditor countries, excluding China, whose role is to find coordinated and sustainable solutions to the payment difficulties experienced by debtor countries, have cited Hambantota port as an example of debt diplomacy. I'm pretty sure, and it's fair that I highlight that the Chinese will beg to disagree, that the Sri Lankans willingly signed that deal, that port was part of an economic development and growth strategy for the Sri Lankans that really simply just did not pan out. And that was through no fault of the Chinese. Be that as it may, Sri Lanka was still on the hook to service the debt, and when they became unable to do so, they had little choice but to sign over that major port infrastructure to the Chinese over a 99-year period. So the third learning objective for the week is to describe the role of the World Bank and IMF in attempting to resolve various debt crises. So, according to the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF for short, it works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all of its 191 member countries. It does so by supporting economic policies that promote financial stability and monetary cooperation, which are essential to increasing productivity, job creation, and economic well-being. The IMF is governed by and accountable to its member countries. The IMF has three critical missions. First, furthering international monetary cooperation. Second, encouraging the expansion of trade and economic growth. And third, discouraging policies that would harm prosperity. To fulfill these missions, IMF member countries work collaboratively with each other and with other international bodies. Specifically, the IMF fosters international financial stability by offering the following services. First, policy advice. A core responsibility of the IMF, again, short for International Monetary Fund, is monitoring the economic and financial policies of member countries and providing them with policy advice, an activity known as surveillance. As part of this process, which also takes place at the global and regional levels, the IMF identifies potential risks and recommends appropriate policy adjustments to sustain economic growth and promote financial stability. The second major role of the IMF is to provide financial assistance, which is the more popular one and the much more controversial role. Unlike development banks, the IMF does not lend for specific projects. Instead, the IMF provides financial support to countries hit by crisis to create breathing room as they implement policies that restore economic stability and growth. The IMF also provides precautionary financing to help prevent crisis. IMF lending is continuously refined to meet countries' changing needs. The next role of the IMF is capacity development. The IMF works to strengthen the capacity of national institutions, including central banks, finance ministries, revenue administration, statistical agencies, and financial sector supervisory agencies. These, in combination, result in more effective policies and a greater economic stability. The IMF works with member countries to modernize their economic policies and make institutions more effective by providing demand-driven, tailored technical assistance and training focused on issues that are critical to economic stability and growth. Of note, capacity development can help countries improve tax collection, modernize monetary and exchange rate policy, develop legal systems, strengthen governance, collect and disseminate data, and much more. Conversely, the World Bank focuses on providing financial and technical assistance to developing countries to reduce poverty and promote sustainable development, and oversee the implementation of free market reforms on behalf of international creditors. Additionally, the World Bank, as appropriate, will finance government programs to support achievement of a country's development objectives and support policy and institutional reforms of national and subnational governments by providing budget financing and global expertise. The World Bank also finances public projects to build physical and social infrastructure and develop institutional capacity. And here are the types of financing by the World Bank Group. Investment project financing provides financing to governments for activities that create the physical, social infrastructure necessary to reduce poverty and create sustainable development. Development policy financing provides budget support to government or a political subdivision for a program of policy and institutional actions to help achieve sustainable, shared growth, and poverty reduction. Programs for results links disbursement of World Bank funds directly to the delivery of defined results, helping countries improve the design and implementation of their own development programs and achieve lasting results by strengthening institutions, enhancing systems, and building capacity. In combination, both institutions being the World Bank Group and the IMF, promote cooperation among nations to address economic challenges and foster global prosperity. Accordingly, both institutions contribute to poverty reduction efforts through their financial and technical assistance programs. The fourth, and I believe the last learning objective for the week, is to describe different international political economy perspectives on the debt crisis, relationships and economics, and between states and markets in world affairs offer three distinct theories on debt crisis. The first theory is the liberal theory. International institutions will intervene. That's the sum of that theory. The second theory is economic nationalist or mercantilist, where states will leverage economic advantages, including debt, to advance national interest. The third theory is the Marxist perspective on the North-South, client-patron, unequal economic relationship, recognizing, of course, that North-South in this context is a shorthand for the industrialized North and the underdeveloped or the developing global Southern countries. And that geography doesn't always align, but again, that's the logic behind it. I wish everyone good luck with this week's assessments, and I will now turn off the recordings as we transition to Q&A and office hour.